Hi, I'm Rob Playfair, EAP practitioner at the University of Liverpool and committee member of the BALEAP Testing, Assessment and Feedback SIG. The interview you're about to watch took place on the 13th of August 2020 with me, Dan Isbell and Benjamin Kremmel. I'll briefly introduce Dan and Benjamin before moving on to the interview. Dan R. Isbell is an assistant professor of second language studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Drawing on his background in operational language testing and language teaching, his research focuses on language assessment and instructed second language acquisition. Benjamin Kremmel is head of the Language Testing Research Group Innsbruck, LTRGI, at the University of Innsbruck, Austria. He is currently a lecturer and researcher at the Department for Subject-Specific Education at the Faculty of Teacher Education. His research interests include vocabulary assessment, L2 reading assessment, diagnostic language testing, language assessment literacy, and SLA. Now let's move on to the interview.
Hello and welcome to the very first BALEAP Testing, Assessment and Feedback Special Interest Group Researcher Interview Series. The purpose of these interviews is to connect contemporary assessment research articles with the concerns of EAP practitioners through discussion with the article's authors. We're here today to discuss an article by our two guests called Test Review, Current Options in At-Home Language Proficiency Tests for Making High-Stakes Decisions, recently published in the journal Language Testing. In the article, Dan and Benjamin review 7 language proficiency tests that users can take at home, considering for each one the purpose, the length, administration, scores, security measures, tech requirements, the publisher, and the price. They then go on to discuss the longer-term challenges and the changes to language assessment that may result from the emergency move to online testing. This is a timely article for EAP practitioners, as many of our current and future students may have used one of these tests to gain admission to university. Dan Isbell and Benjamin Kremmel, thanks very much for joining me today to discuss your article.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Just to start, how did you come to write this article?
Oh gosh, we were invited by the editors of Language Testing, Paula Winke and Luke Harding. They were interested in like you mentioned, a timely sort of response to all these things going on that are affecting so many language programs around the world. And that's how Ben and I got connected. I'm guessing maybe they asked 2 people just because it was a tall order in a short time to accomplish this review. So
yeah, I think so Dan and I are both on the editorial board of Language Testing, and I think that's why they reached out to us. I think some of it was also triggered by discussions that both professionals and researchers within our community have been having via our LTestL mailing list. And there's also some BALEAP people on that mailing list who also chipped in with their thoughts and their queries and concerns. And I think that's what set the whole thing in motion pretty much.
Yeah, I noticed you had in the acknowledgement section, there was a long list of names in there, one from the BALEAP SIG actually, Sam Barclay. Yeah, I guess it was a kind of, would you say it was kind of crowd sourced, some of the information?
Yeah, we definitely reached out pretty widely to colleagues that we have working for different testing organizations in different countries to try to, I don't know, take a pulse of what's going on, what sort of changes are people making, in response to basically live in-person testing being shut down.
Okay. Okay, so my first question about the article itself is, I noticed that when you were describing the different tests, there's quite big differences between some of them. So, for example, the Duolingo test takes about an hour, and it doesn't have a particular academic focus. And then the IELTS indicator has got more of an academic focus, takes over 2 hours. And I was kind of thinking for university admissions processes, often these scores are presented as comparable. You get these equivalency tables where 110 on the Duolingo equals 6.5 in IELTS. And I was just wondering what your thoughts on how reliable those kind of equivalencies are, with considering the differences in the tests themselves.
Yeah, I think a lot of the studies that are presented, if there are studies at all, I mean, sometimes it's also kind of a black box that's, and you don't quite know where these equivalency tables come from. But if there is research, then it's often just comparing, or it's looking at score equivalencies, and that's one thing, but there's more to it than that. There's more to it than simply sort of doing correlational studies. You also, I think in our view, you have to look at the construct or what the test is actually testing. And there's not just equivalency in scores you should be concerned with, but you should also look at equivalency of test content or the skills that are being measured, the amount of academic focus you have in there, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, just to add on to that, like Benjamin said, you can run correlations between any two tests, and I believe that's what's been done with Duolingo and the regular IELTS and Duolingo and the TOEFL. But yeah, the construct is really what counts, and for making specific decisions. For example, another sort of wrinkle into this is, I know throughout much of the world, including Europe and I believe the UK, sort of the B2 level is often used as a cutoff for admit or not admit, or admit for pre-sessional versus fully admit, things like those kind of decisions. And so these different tests can all be linked to the CEFR, but what is described as a B2 level performance on one test might look or feel different than a B2 performance on another test. There's been some research into this. Bart Digers, who's at, I think at KU Leuven, he did some research on B2 level speaking performances from a couple of different tests, I believe of Dutch, if I remember right, and found some kind of qualitative differences in what does a B2 on test A mean and what does a B2 on test B mean. So yeah, just really reiterating Benjamin's point that you can do these correlational analyses, but you should also be thinking a little more deeply about these sort of straightforward or seemingly straightforward score alignments.
Yeah, I mean, the IELTS scores have got a big influence on kind of university admissions here in the UK. And within that, when you look at those equivalency tables, within the B2 band, there are 3 IELTS possible bands. There's it goes from 5.5 up to 6.5, which is huge, a huge difference in terms of looking at the kinds of what that means in terms of what students can do in IELTS. But in terms of it being B2, that it kind of covers it. So what sometimes we end up doing is having B2 minus, B2, B2 plus, B2 plus plus, and it almost loses its meaning,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's partly, I think, due to some shortcomings that the CFR has. Partly, it's just in the nature of testing, I guess. But you do have to wonder at what point these accommodations, in a way, that you make as a practitioner, because you have to make do with what you have, don't you? You have to wonder at what point those, as you say, lose meaning or start looking a bit absurd. Yeah.
And another interesting thing with the IELTS, kind of like the CEFR, I mean, well, the CEFR is even more coarse, right? These are sort of big chunks of proficiency, A1, A2, B1, so forth. But the IELTS, and I'd imagine, this is especially relevant in the UK, where it is kind of the premier exam for a lot of higher education purposes. Compared to a test like even the TOEFL, which is on a scale of 0 to 120, you know, the difference in grain size, if you want to say that, say a 6.5 is your cut score based on the IELTS, where does that 6.5 exactly line up? It probably lines up to a range of scores on the TOEFL or Duolingo or Pearson's scale. And so there, you know, you can run into, you know, you do your best, give it your best shot. You try to pick a cut score. Okay, you know, 6.5 on the IELTS would be about, I don't have a concordance table right in front of me, but let's just say like a 91 on the TOEFL. It's like, where do you get that precision of 91, you know, versus, well, why not 90 or 92? But you're going to be making the same kinds of decisions, and then that can lead to some, you know, maybe unintended impacts where about particular candidates.
Yeah, and I think the problem is, of course, you have to put a cut score somewhere, right? You have to, and that's all you can do is make the best possible judgment on where that cut score should be, and make the best possible effort to support that cut score with research. But you'll always have that argument that, yeah, why is it exactly that 1 point extra, and what's putting that like over the boundary, and what isn't? That's just something you have to live with, and I guess it's still better than many other alternatives in that you have a test, you have some transparency in what's in the test and what it's trying to measure, and you have some transparency as to what a cut score means. Of course, the problem with these equivalencies to CEFR or also to IELTS, there's also the issue of, well, one, marketability, of course, but also there's the CFR has a tremendous currency. So there's an aim for having exams linked or aligned to the CFR. More so with the bands than with the actual contents often of the CFR. And also, I guess some similar arguments could be made for the IELTS test that also has a tremendous currency, particularly in the UK higher education area, where it's always, oh, well, what's that on an IELTS? If you have a pre-sessional course or exam, well, what would that mean for an IELTS band? And so, to some degree, it's also unfair of accusing these instruments for making these comparisons, because, for instance, the CFR wasn't exactly designed to do all that. Yeah, it is probably still better than just throwing a coin, I guess. Mm-hmm. Tossing a coin now.
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to pick up on another point that you mentioned in the article. You talked about the challenges of transferring a paper-based test to a computer-based test, and how there could be some validity issues if you're using the same validity evidence that you've got from the paper-based test. It doesn't necessarily transfer when the same test is done on via computer. Why is that? Why did you say that?
Well, I guess for one, it just makes a lot of assumptions that there would be no difference. If you want to claim that, you know, we're just taking our same test and putting it on a computer, you know, it's the same test, really, believe us. I mean, that's still a claim that needs to be supported. And oftentimes, you know, you will find similar measurement properties, kind of similar test taker processes, you know, being engaged in on a digitally delivered version of essentially the same test. But again, it's sort of something that ought to be verified. Kind of way back when the TOEFL made the switch from paper-based to computer-based, and this was like, they were doing this research late 90s, early 2000s. It might seem almost quaint to us today, but they did extensive research on test taker populations, looking at their familiarity with digital tools. Because one thing that can happen when you go online is if your test takers are not as familiar, not very comfortable with typing on a keyboard, using a mouse, manipulating a graphical user interface, their test scores can be influenced in irrelevant ways by their struggles with technology. So that it seems very foundational. Maybe we often take it for granted now. You know, we're sort of exposed to these kind of buzzwords like digital natives, you know, just assuming that most young people taking exams today would just be fine with computerized versions. But it's something, you know, that you still might want to verify. I think too, it relates to some skills more than others. So when you think about writing ability and measuring writing ability, you know, the way we write with pen and paper versus the way we're able to write now with word processing software, with a mouse and computer, cutting and pasting, moving text around, all of that, it's quite different. The process that we go through in writing and composing. So, you know, there needs to be, at some point, I would argue, you know, it's incumbent on the test provider to investigate the computerized delivery of their tests to see what changes might have happened, or, you know, again, you very well might find that it's mostly the same kind of story being told about learners' abilities, but showing it, you know, being able to show that empirically is a good thing. And I think that can inspire confidence to test users when they make that switch or when the test switches formats.
Yeah, I think the point that Dan's making about this constant need for revalidation, or as soon as you change one parameter in your text, you need to show empirically how it affects the whole assessment system, and beyond just the scores and the score equivalency, that can't be stressed enough. It probably even applies to research that's been done, as Dan has said, sort of late 90s, because things have changed or are changing so quickly that even that kind of research we might need to revisit. And another reason why we made that claim is that we do have fairly solid research evidence now that they aren't the same, even though we are dealing with digital natives. So we have research coming out of Lancaster, Tineke Beaufort, Luke Harding, Aaron Batty, who've shown that for writing in one of the Trinity exams, there was largely score equivalency, but there certainly wasn't equivalency in terms of the cognitive processes. We also have research coming out of Krella in Bedfordshire on the IELTS speaking, the computerized speaking exam, where they've shown, yes, there is to some extent score equivalency between a face-to-face and a digitally delivered speaking exam. But the things that are going on, the nature of the communication, a lot of these things, even the rating process is to some extent different, and that's what we want to know.
So would it be that then we couldn't expect necessarily students who are getting a score via an online test, they wouldn't necessarily be able to do the same things as the same score in a face-to-face or a paper-based test?
That could be the case, or you might find that they're able to do more things or do things better in an online test, and that might vary across test takers. You know, those who are, say, more comfortable with technology, who do video calls more often and just feel a little bit more at ease. You know, they don't have as much anxiety, for example, or, you know, they're quite good at typing, they might do better on an online or digitally delivered exam. So I think it's, yeah, I think you're right on point there, but I also think it's important to remember it could go both ways for an individual. So even though you find broad kind of score equivalencies like Benjamin mentioned, individuals will differ in how closely their scores align in either type of exam, digital or kind of pen and paper based.
Okay, thanks. Kind of connected to that, I guess, is something you said you were talking about the future trends, how language testing could kind of evolve in its online kind of form. And you talked about how you said it could increase the relevance to real world language use. And you cited, I think, Sarah Oh's 2020 article when she talks about broadening the construct of writing to include things like spell check, online dictionaries, that kind of thing. I mean, from an EAP point of view, it's kind of like music to my ears, because that's exactly the sort of thing that we're preparing students for. And we tend to think about language use as an integrated sort of thing. You know, you produce a textual outcome, so like a research project, which involves all sorts of different processes, both reading and writing. Seminar discussions, you know, which involve listening to lectures or reading articles and then coming in and talking about them, and that kind of integrated use of language. So I was just kind of wondering if that is a direction that testing moves, proficiency tests as well. What kind of issues should we kind of be considering when designing tests or when trying to understand tests which do reflect that kind of more real world language use?
Yeah, there's so much there. This is sort of like, you know, this is where we got a little bit, I think Benjamin put it in our discussions, kind of like blue sky thinking, you know, like, gosh, what could language testing be and what could it become? So yeah, you know, we do cite Sarah Oh's article, which is really interesting, and I find that, though, you know, I was glad to hear that you were very receptive to this idea that, yeah, you know, what's wrong with using spell checkers or dictionaries or other sort of very common writing tools. I think it's also a bit of a polarizing idea still among many language testing and maybe EAP professionals, you know, oh, well, we want to see their real ability and so forth. Presumably real means without, you know, tools that every writer uses. But, you know, I think it would be so easy now to include these things. I mean, these are just like built-in features for Microsoft Word that can be built into web browser tools. So looking at that, I think is interesting. You know, as ways of making writing in the test more like writing in the real world. You know, we're always limited in tests by sort of practical concerns, often time. You know, you mentioned, you know, we do research projects where you read a lot of things, you listen to some things, you write a report that goes through several drafts. So we can't do that in a test, probably, even with all the best technology in the world, just because we don't have enough time, or the test takers don't have enough time to spend a week, you know, working on a paper for an exam. But, you know, the question is, like, what can we do to get us closer to more relevant academic tasks? And this sort of aligns with the view of testing that is a little bit more focused on alignment between what's in the test and the sort of tasks that are undertaken in the real world. The technical term here is a target language use domain. But basically, if you're sending students to university on the basis of these test results, you want your tests to reflect as much as possible the kind of tasks they would do in a university. And I think now with you know, the COVID crisis, we're seeing sort of an acceleration of doing things on computers in education. You know, so I mean, even extending this to speaking, I mean, students are giving presentations via webcam with slide decks, you know, being shared across screens. Could that be done in a test? Can you get multi-test taker speaking tasks going on? You know, cooperative sort of tasks or negotiation type of tasks that some tests have done in-person iterations before. Some of the Michigan tests have done that, where you have 2 interviewees and maybe 2 interviewers. There's a test in China, one of the one of the tests for English majors in China, where they, via computer, connect 2 examinees at the same time. So there's kind of some promising leads in that direction. But just, you know, thinking about my own higher ed teaching for the last few months, you know, I've been having students talking to each other via webcam. Could that happen in a test?
Well, even thinking beyond just tests, just assessments in general, but even if we're talking about just what we traditionally understand as a test or one of these proficiency exams, I think those are generally interested in using the score as an indicator, as Dan has said, for how well this person would do in the real world. And for testing, for those scores or for those tests to be relevant, I think we got to aim at mirroring the real world as best we can, despite all of the practical constraints that we might have. And so I think the key word here is as has already been mentioned, is authenticity. So what do we need to include in our tests to make them like the real world? Is it integrated tasks, as you've said, Rob? I think we just got to take into account more than we have to this day that a lot of communication is happening in the digital realm and has done before COVID even. And that's got to be reflected in our tests and our assessments. It's got to be reflected in the way we test writing or speaking, as Dan said, but even beyond that, the way we read digitally is different. How does a test account for that? The way we listen, like if I listen to something on a podcast or on YouTube or even a pre-recorded lecture, I can self-pace the listening. I can go back, I can rewind, I can replay things, and all those things, at least we don't have the answers to how we're going to implement these or how we should implement these. But what we're saying is, as we're moving forward, we might as well use this transition point and start reflecting on this some more, how tests should look like to be more authentic. Because of course there's also the danger of going the other way with online delivery, in that you do, as a test developer, you do what's sort of relatively easy to do. And this sounds a bit more harsh than I mean it, but we got to be careful, for instance, for interactive speaking not to get lost, because it's more difficult to do that in a digital or online environment than if I just record a message to the computer. And so I think these are all just important and interesting questions that we wanted to raise without necessarily having the answers. But I do think there are quite exciting avenues that could be explored, and that are explored by a lot of researchers and test developers.
Yeah, and to sort of extend on this and maybe take it in a little bit of a different direction. So two of the tests that we reviewed, the Duolingo English test and Pearson's Versant test, both of those tests have endured a fair bit of criticism for being less authentic. And, I think there have been a lot of questions, discussions about, should we adopt one of the Pearson exams? Should we start accepting Duolingo? Because there are some concerns, a test that can be administered so quickly that doesn't seem to have a lot of task alignment, between the test and what goes on at universities. Those are really important questions. And I don't mean that to be exclusively critical of those two tests. Benjamin said that, sometimes test developers go for what's easier to do with digital things. And to some extent, maybe that applies, but at the same time, I think you want to recognize, in terms of thinking towards the future, the potential, in some ways, Pearson and Duolingo have some extremely advanced and well put together technology when it comes to things like speech recognition or delivering adaptive tests and things that could be really harnessed towards kind of our loftiest ideals for what tests and assessments could be. But yeah, I think this issue of authenticity is something that I think a lot of EAP practitioners probably think a lot about, because I think when you're thinking about your curriculum and your EAP programs, you strive for that kind of alignment between, okay, what are the skills, the aspects of language that I'm teaching, how do those align with the university? How will what I do in the classroom, how will that benefit the students when they leave, when they go outside of our sort of like warm embrace of the EAP classroom, where we provide a lot of support. We have similar concerns in assessment too. As Ben said, we want to see a good alignment, because we're going to make decisions about these individuals that are very relevant to their success once they exit the testing. Well, they don't exit the test center anymore, but once they finish the test, just like when they finish a pre-sessional program, they kind of go off and have to fend for themselves to some extent. So yeah, this authenticity issue, I think, especially for EAP practitioners, it is really, I would guess, it's probably at the center of a lot of our concerns with these shifts to online tests.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, from a pre-sessional point of view, we tend to develop our own in-house tests. So we've had to kind of figure out how to do that in an online environment. Test security has been a big issue, as you talk about in the article as well, about how to ensure that. And it makes a lot of the kind of traditional paper-based tests that we've done, especially for reading and listening, almost impossible to do from a security point of view. So yeah, I think it's always a concern with EAP, but now it's kind of pushed it to the front of it in terms of the assessment, and almost we don't really have a choice but to kind of address it, because otherwise there'd be no test at all.
Right. Yeah, and that's something, of course, we focused on, sort of these larger scale, high impact decision sort of tests. But when we reached out to colleagues around the world to find out how this all was impacting them, a lot of them brought up stories similar to what you spoke about. The need to take our local test to an online format. There was an ILTA webinar too, and I believe it was Jim Purpura and his student, Devurdefard, I forget her first name, I'm so sorry, who talked about how they went to extensive lengths to not just digitize one of their typically in-person exams, but also to try to make it secure. I believe they brought in a third-party test proctoring service, which we note in the review that even several of the major publishers are working with kind of third-party specialists in exam security, because I think that's another major concern, is security, as you've mentioned, which is tough, and especially trying to put together secure conditions in a relatively short notice, as we were all sort of, the world, it seems, was caught off guard by COVID.
And we've seen how difficult that is or was for those sort of major test providers, and now what are departments going to, like EAP departments, going to do that have a fraction of the resources available that those big or even mid-scale testing organizations have?
Yeah, this is
okay.
It's very much uncharted waters, and we're gonna have to see how things play out. I guess so people listening, keep track of how things worked out. This needs to be written about or talked about going forward, because well, we hope this is the last global pandemic for quite a while, but you never know what the next sort of shift in conditions will be that will kind of disrupt our practice in teaching and testing and so forth.
Well, that moves on to another question that I wanted to pick up on, because you did kind of almost quite pessimistically say that future, it's likely that we're going to have similar kinds of disruptions to face-to-face administration. So we should be kind of not thinking this as a blip, but more as like a kind of a future trend. And I was kind of interested thinking about it from, as Benjamin says, like the very limited resources that we have within an EAP department. What kind of questions should we be asking to look at the tests, and what sort of methodology should we use to investigate them and to collect data and make decisions about them?
Well, I think what your first port of call will be to look at the test itself and the test content or the test construct. Now, some test providers are more generous with information about their tests than others, and have more validation evidence published or even published in peer-reviewed outlets than others. But I think that's sort of the first port of call, is to look at the test and what are the tasks, how do they align with what I'm doing in my teaching or what I need for my decision making. Other than that, I think it's essentially more collaboration that's going to get us there between, say, EAP teachers and testing researchers, because I think both worlds have insights that the other might not have, and both have resources that the others might not have. So as you say, I think it's a very tall order to ask any EAP department or EAP teacher to basically do full test reviews of everything that's available out there. I mean, there are resources to help with that, like language testing. The journal has made all test reviews open access, so those are available, but you still need the time to plow through them. So I think essentially there needs to be more of a dialogue between the people who need certain information and the people who might have certain information, and I think that could be fruitful in both directions.
Yeah, really good points. I mean, the more people work together on these problems from different perspectives, I think the better we'll understand the impacts of these decisions of switching to a different test, or when a test switches its delivery format. Just some ideas about methodology. You can look at sort of student success metrics, in the years preceding COVID, based on, your typical placement or admissions exam, and then look at what's happening after. This won't be a strictly controlled experiment, because also, I mean, the entire higher education environment has changed. People being admitted now are going into online instruction for their first semester or longer. Gosh, I hope not. But that's going to have an impact on the educational outcomes. Nonetheless, I think as much as you can, try to evaluate the quality or the impacts of decisions made based on the tests that you're using. Do you notice any sort of very salient differences, from when you were using the IELTS pen and paper to if you're now using the IELTS indicator? Are you seeing a difference in, for example, the volume of students being admitted or a proportion of applicants? In pre-sessional programs, are students taking longer to get through it, or are they struggling more academically than previously, or vice versa? Maybe it works better. I think these are things that programs can look at in terms of trying to understand the impact of a different test or a test in a different format. And gosh, I know language assessment researchers would love to hear about all of this. And again, like Ben said, more opportunities to collaborate, dialogue, because it's always harder to look at the impacts of tests, because that's more of a longer term enterprise, in terms of research. And so in some ways, practitioners in EAP programs and in universities are better positioned, because that's part of your daily work, is to track these students and work with them for an extended period of time. So I think there's a lot of potential for more focus on impacts, impacts of decisions in assessment. And so hopefully we'll see some of that going forward. More of that going forward, I should say. People do these things already, but maybe this sort of event that everybody was kind of thrown into will be sort of a really kickstart a lot of research into this area at a level we haven't maybe seen before.
I mean, we found since we only set up this the BALEAP SIG, the testing SIG, in March this year, which timed, completely coincidentally with the COVID lockdown. But we found there's, the first webinar we ran, we had 200 people coming along to it to hear about some approaches to online testing. So it does seem like it's something that everybody's thinking about. Practitioners as well as researchers. But I guess one of the issues that I've found as someone who's interested in assessment from an EAP point of view is where is that forum? Like how do you make those connections? I mean, this is one of the reasons for doing this kind of interview, is like trying to find those connections between people that with different knowledge, different experience, different resources to kind of connect.
Yeah, I think some of the forums are already there. It's probably a matter of reaching out or entering into those. Like there is an awareness that BALEAP has a conference. I've been to events like EAP in the Midlands when I was still based in Nottingham. So there are these forums, and if they aren't there, and likewise we have testing conferences that obviously everyone from the EAP community is very warmly invited to attend, like IELTA or LTRC of ILTA, or even UCALTA, the UK Association of Language Testing and Assessment. So I think these forums are there. We're beginning to see more interaction there. And if they aren't there, then we just got to reach out to each other and create them. Like with this interview, or when Sam reached out for me to attend the EAP in the Midlands event. And so I think, yeah, the connections are there already, and we're probably going to see more of that happening in the future.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think, even more locally in the program you work in, there's probably somebody very interested in assessment. I'm not sure the structure of programs in the UK so much, but in my experience in EAP programs in the United States, we had specific testing offices, the small group of people who ran the placement exam and advised on achievement testing for the EAP program. I mean, you probably have coworkers or colleagues who are interested in assessment, and they might have connections, fairly strong ones, to the larger assessment community, and that's one way to kind of spark a dialogue. So talk to your colleagues. Well, I guess we don't peek in, see if we don't knock on somebody's office door anymore, but give them a ring on Zoom or Teams and talk. Yeah, see what are areas of mutual interest, see what they know. And I think too, of course, language assessment researchers, if you're listening, reach out to your colleagues in EAP, get that dialogue started from the other side of it as well.
And I think if I can just add on to that, I think there's also a responsibility, not just with the individuals within these communities, but also on a systemic level, because from the experience that I've had from discussions with EAP people in the UK, it's most of the times it's not for a lack of interest that these dialogues aren't happening, and it's not for a lack of problems or concerns that need addressing, or for a lack of motivation. It's often a lack of resources and time. And that's where I think universities, as unlikely as this plea might come into fruition, but I think universities and departments need to make space for that and need to support researchers in doing this, and also need to support particularly EAP practitioners to get time and space and resources to address these things. Because otherwise it's still going to be sort of little islands, and everyone's just kind of trying to cope with their own problems, not realizing that there's plenty of other people and teams that are facing the same issues, that might have come up with solutions or workable approaches. So I think it's all well and good putting responsibilities on the individuals reaching out to each other, but I think ideally we would also want to see some changes on a larger scale or on a higher level in institutions to enable this kind of thing.
Okay, I think that's a great place to end the discussion. Unless you guys had anything else you wanted to add, or no? Fantastic. Dan Isbell Benjamin Kremmel, thank you very much for joining us for this first interview. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks.